And so he was a legend, to put it mildly. And he was so famous that there began to develop this kind of cult of personality. Be like Andrew Jackson, be like Old Hickory. And so people started modeling their lives after him. And one thing that happened was this really increased presidential power. Andrew Jackson was building more power into the presidency, but at the same time, he was trying to give as much governmental power back to the people. And that was the idea behind this whole democratic movement, was to give as much power back to the people as possible. But for President Jackson to do that, he had to get the power into the presidency first so that he could release it then back out to the people. And so this presidency created these new Democrats. And we see Democrats rise as this sort of, president needs to have a certain level of power, but that power needs to be used to assure states' rights and give as much power back to the common man as possible. Well, as the Democrats develop, the remaining Democratic Republicans splinter into smaller groups, and perhaps the most important of these groups are the Whigs. And the Whigs develop specifically to counter Andrew Jackson in his cult of personality. They aren't necessarily against states' rights, but they don't like how Andrew Jackson is adding power to the presidency. They believe that power belongs to Congress, not the president. And so they're fighting directly against Andrew Jackson. So they kind of become their own party, and the Democratic Republicans slowly break into a number of different smaller political parties, and you're left with the Whigs and the Democrats. Well, the Whigs are going to have some trouble because once Andrew Jackson is out of office, he only serves for 8 years. Suddenly, one of their main campaign points are gone. You can't have an anti Jackson party without Jackson. And so the Whigs now begin to just kind of limp along, and their membership fractures into smaller political parties. And so you have kind of the Democrats holding sway until 1854, where a new political party rises and is able to actually field a presidential candidate who loses. But this party is an anti-slavery party that kind of takes some old Whigs and some old Democratic Republicans and adds them to uh, the Free Soil Party, which was one of the first major anti-slavery parties, and kind of combines them together into this new party known as the Republicans. And the Republicans limp along for a little while until in 1860 they have this candidate named Abraham Lincoln, who is a crafty fella. He uses his political influence to rise above more powerful rivals by convincing all of his rivals to make him their second choice. Since he's not really a threat to anyone, he goes to each one independently and says, hey, if you look like you're going to lose, just have your people switch their vote to me, because there's no way that I'm going to win. And at least you can make sure that, the person who you don't want to win doesn't get in. Well, he convinces his other three rivals to all do this. And so once they're all knocked out of the nomination process, he's the only one left. And so he ends up getting the Republican nomination over people who are much more established in the party than him. He goes on to win the presidency. He goes on to fight for the preservation of the Union and anti-slavery. But it's really his election that's the coming out party for the Republicans. And now the Republicans and the Democrats have set the stage for what's going to be the major political parties for the next 150 years. But these Republicans and Democrats are not the ones that we know today. The Republicans in this particular case are based out of the North. They are pro city. They are, you know, willing to invest power in a strong central government to try to preserve the Union, whereas the Democrats of this time are pro slavery. They are for states' rights and a literal interpretation of the Constitution. And so this is not the role that we expect to see from Republicans and Democrats. So what changed? It was the big switch of 1959 through 1964, and this is where we see the birth of our modern political parties. During the big switch, we see the black vote change. From the end of the Civil War until 1956, the black vote in the United States was reliably Republican. Something around 80% of the black vote in the United States or more went Republican in national elections. But the 1940s and 50s sees the rise of the civil rights movement, and we start to see some cracks in the foundation of the black vote allegiance to the Republican Party. And part of this is because of the Republican Party's choices themselves. And the best example of this is the Martin Luther King arrest in 1959. Martin Luther King is arrested in the American South during 1959, and black leaders appeal to Vice President Richard Nixon, who is running against John F. Kennedy for the 1960 election, to intercede on King's behalf and get him removed from prison. Nixon's official response was no comment. So King's people reached out to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to go, and that Robert Kennedy is the one on the right on your screen. Nixon's on your left, Martin Luther King Center. Robert Kennedy went and got Martin Luther King released. And in this moment, we see a huge mistake by the Republican Party as far as maintaining their dominance of the black vote. With Nixon not coming to support of civil rights leaders, the Republican Party has left themselves open to allowing the Democrats to take civil rights as an issue from them. And the Democrats are more than willing to do that. Kennedy, in particular, is willing to make civil rights a bigger part of his platform than Nixon is. Nixon knows that a lot of his support in the South is rather tenuous, and if he takes on civil rights as one of his issues, he may not win in Texas and other traditionally borderline Republican areas. Kennedy, on the other hand, has nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking on this issue. And so we start to see in the 1960 election that the black vote starts to swing over to the Democrats. And not only that, but we start to see a movement from Republican to Democrat in the North. Because as Nixon doubles down on not taking civil rights as an issue, and the Democratic Party taking on more of civil rights as an issue, we start to see the North, which has historically been pro-civil rights, accept more of the Democratic platform, and the South, that has been historically more for segregation and slavery, begin to accept the Republican platform. And it's stark when you look at the electoral maps of this era. So if we start here in 1956, we can see the Solid South, which is what this section right here is called. All right, the Solid South normally votes together. In fact, in almost every presidential election, the Solid South votes together. And you can see that they are firmly Democratic.